Catherine and William Booth saw Christ in the lost and broken. Their mission? To realise the kingdom through a world-redeeming gospel of personal and social transformation. In this final program, we're going to look at some of the means employed by the Salvation Army and assess their continued relevance for today. Today we're constantly assaulted by the pace of change. What relevance can a peculiarly dressed Protestant hangover from the 19th century have for a post-industrial world in which transport and communications profoundly affect every detail of our lives? Just how appropriate are the structures and beliefs of a past era to the present? It's the sort of question William Booth was quite prepared to confront. Booth once commented,
"The Army's future depends upon the Army. If she is energetic and faithful and steadfast, she will go from great to greater things. If she is slothful and slackens her zeal, she will perish. Yes, I hope she will perish and be swept away, for dead things should not encumber the ground, but should make place for the living."
To which Booth's non-Salvationist friend, the great crusading journalist W.T. Stead, in typical fashion responded,
"The Salvation Army has grown so rapidly and evolved so many agencies, built so many edifices, and created, in short, so substantial a temporal skeleton and material tabernacle, that even if it lost its soul, its corpse would be terribly long in decomposing."
Whilst vastly different in size and scope, in many ways the issues that brought the Salvation Army into existence and shaped its character are similar to our own. By the mid-19th century, a revolution in transport and communications was shrinking the world, for both good and ill. For all their evils, the dark satanic mills seemed to produce new wonders every day. The Salvation Army itself is an expression of this new world. Rather than retreat from change and wail against it, as many churches and social commentators were doing, the Salvation Army embraced the goods of this global revolution and used them as weapons against the very evils that revolution created. When Catherine and William Booth were born in 1829, a person rarely moved farther from their home than a day's journey by horse, around 15 miles. By the end of Booth's life, aircraft crossed continents. In the 1860s, undersea cables and the miracles of Morse code began to make the world one of instantaneous communication. The world of sail had given way to steam and begun to tame the great wild oceans of the world, making them safer and cheaper and faster. The world could now be crossed by ordinary folk in days and weeks, not months and years. Commerce and trade expanded rapidly. The mills of Manchester were dependent on the paddocks of Australia and the cotton fields of Georgia. A harvest lost in Alabama could mean unemployment in Bradford. Business was global. These inventions made the Salvation Army possible. In the last decades of his life, William Booth toured incessantly to encourage his troops in every corner of the globe. The telegraph made international command and control possible. From 1904 to 1907, William Booth travelled from John O'Groats to Land's End in a series of national motor tours, preaching from an open-topped car in village after village, from one end of Britain to the other. One of the greatest images of technological triumph over the wild world was the great lighthouse of the Bell Rock. Constructed against great odds in the 1840s, its narrow beam came to symbolise the light of progress penetrating the darkness of the world, an image readily exploited by the Salvation Army as the central symbol of the Darkest England scheme. The origins of the Army can be traced to the failed response of the Church to the rapidly changing social conditions resulting from the Industrial Revolution. In the 1850s, the first census of church attendance in Britain found that the urban poor were not in church. Parishes had not kept pace with the vast growth of cities. The problems of the poor could no longer be resolved at the village level by charity and goodwill. Often, the cause or cure of local ills lay with decisions taken in Westminster, Manchester, or even Chicago. The immediate origins of the Salvation Army can be seen in the last months of the Christian mission. Seated with Booth at the final mission conference is Bramwell on his left and Railton on his right. The mission committee system Booth found troublesome. Mission stations in different locations wanted different policies. One dissident voice could frustrate an entire committee. Real decisions could be long delayed. Effective action was minimal. At issue was a question not just of effective practice, but of the very nature of the church. Booth had been brought up as a Wesleyan, one who saw the church as a connected whole, not simply a collection of local congregations. Indeed, he had tried and rejected the Reformed Congregationalist model early in his career.
The ideal of the local church, which is the only church that you really need to be conscious of, goes back to the 17th century and is associated with the Congregationalists, who were often at the time called independents because they believed that every church should be independent. It became very influential in the 19th century, but the Salvation Army in its early stages had no truck with it. It was connectional, it was not independent.
The very name of the branch of Methodism embraced by Catherine and William reflected their understanding of the nature of the church, the Methodist New Connection.
The tradition of thinking that goes back to John Wesley was very emphatic that Christians belong together. He believed that Christians should meet together, but he also believed that the gospel should be spread by preachers going out in cooperative groups and working areas. And the whole network of spreading the gospel must be done by a connection, that is, societies that were connected with each other and gave each other mutual support. So Wesleyan connectionalism was a principle that Booth was brought up with and transferred into the Salvation Army.
Booth was grappling with the frustrations of a localised system that was inadequate for the demands of the time. As he later summarised in Darkest England,
in a small community, everyone, rich and poor, is more or less cognizant of the sufferings of the community. In a large town, where people have ceased to be neighbourly, there is only a congested mass of population settled down on a certain small area without any human ties connecting them together. What we have to do, therefore, is grow a new nervous system for the body politic, to create a swift, almost automatic means of communication between the community as a whole and the meanest of its members, so as to restore to the city what the village possesses.
In the 1890s, Booth was grappling with what a century later we would recognise as the global village. If the village model was no longer adequate to deal with the ills of civil society, parish-based structures were no longer sufficient to deal with the evils generated by that society. What was needed was a new approach to being church, a fresh expression of his Wesleyan faith.
Young people are where they grow up now. Even if they grow up in a rural village, they're still part of the global village. Even if they're in a very small community, within seconds by their cell phone or by their PC, they are connected to this kind of international community. And I think the Salvation Army offers them the opportunity to be involved in that. In my country, in my territory, young people have spent the last 12 months really engaging with the issue of human trafficking. And there's that sense of, this is what I'm doing in my youth group on Tuesday evening, but I know that almost by Wednesday morning, I'm making a difference in someone's life, be it through an act of advocacy with government or international government or the United Nations, or by a whole bunch of money I raised, which is going to set up a new centre in the Philippines to prevent young people from being trafficked. And I think there's that sense that the Salvation Army provides that kind of network where we can do something in our small corner of the world and yet it have an impact on a very far corner of the world, possibly all over the world.
The Salvation Army's understanding of God's love for the world unleashed a renewed global perspective on the nature of mission, and a fresh vision of the means to achieve it. On the front page of the Christian Mission magazine that first used the words Salvation Army, Booth includes two quotes. Neither are from Booth or from members of the mission. One is from the Archbishop of Canterbury, calling for mass mobilisation in the cause of Christ. The other from the great Wesleyan crusader against child labour, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, declaring that the poor could only be effectively reached from amongst themselves. Both of these insights came to consistently characterise the Salvation Army as developed by Booth. They were there from the beginning. These principles unleashed a new movement based on a radical understanding of oneness in Christ, a world-embracing ecclesiology of a globally coordinated priesthood of all believers. The historian Ken Inglis singles out the idea of the poor being reached from among themselves as the single most effective tool in the mass mobilisation that saw the Army's rapid international expansion.
With minor exceptions, they were the only group of Christian evangelists of their time who approached working-class non-worshippers at their own cultural level.
In towns and villages across the world, it was this active, mobilised soldiery that became the shock troops of the movement. No more church services for the faithful. Worship was to be an active expression of the love of God. An army was a mobile force, centrally controlled and directed. A corps was a mobile unit within the army. Many early corps simply took numbers rather than distinct names. Fitzroy 1, Stockholm 7, Minneapolis 4. When enough were recruited at one place, they joyously moved on to the next.
If we go back into the history of the church, I think originally Tyndale translated the word ecclesia as congregation, as opposed to later translations which translated it as church, church being seen as something static and immovable, whereas congregation had within its translation this sense of this living, breathing, dynamic organism known as the community of faith, the people of the way, that changed and transitioned and lived and breathed the kingdom message and did whatever needed to be done to get the job done on the ground. And of course, that's exactly the heart of what Booth meant when he said, we're going to be an army.
The word soldiership was deliberately chosen to distinguish it from membership. In the words of the Soldiers' Covenant, having accepted Jesus Christ as my Saviour and desiring to fulfil my membership of His church on earth as a soldier of the Salvation Army, I now by God's grace enter into a sacred covenant. This is an intentional commitment to personal and corporate activism, beyond the requirements of repent, believe, be born again.
It concerns me that in our modern army we have equated soldiership with membership. I would like us to rediscover, I think, this original dynamic sense of what soldiership is about. It's actually about the mission, and members aren't people who are going to just go and sit and be a part of it. They have to be involved in the mission.
Soldiership is belonging and being actively engaged in all aspects of Christian ministry. It's not just a rite of passage, it's not just membership, it is more than in every respect.
How to involve our capable lay leaders, as well as input from around the world internationally in terms of officer leadership as well, is something that's going to be very difficult to work out, I think, but I think it can be done. I think there needs to be a strategic planning forums in which our best lay minds as well as our best officer minds are involved. And I think only with that kind of a teamwork can international cohesion and focus and strong direction going to be possible, really.
Consistent with the priesthood of all believers, distinctions between officers and soldiers were functional rather than sacramental. John Sampson was a talented young officer musician when called upon by Commissioner Thomas Coombs to join one of the Guards bands that toured Australia during the 1890s. He was asked to surrender his rank and function as a soldier for the duration of the appointment with the Austral Guards, after which he would return to another officer appointment. He did not resume his officership for 5 years.
My understanding of the Salvation Army officer in the early days of the Army was that they were the officer who led the soldiers in the mission. the idea of being that functional leader is probably more important to them than the idea of being some priestly leader who has a spiritual authority. Certainly they led the spiritual mission of the army, but it was in the sense of leading the troops rather than giving the sacrament.
From movements within Catholicism such as Opus Dei through to the missionary commitment of all young Mormons, the call to a sacrificial life beyond membership is characteristic of many of the most rapidly growing religious movements. In 1928, the year before the end of her husband's term as general, Florence Booth, the wife of Bramwell Booth, wrote,
"The kingdom of Satan and sin will never be overthrown by a body of officers as officers only. Our founders raised the Salvation Army because they saw clearly there should be an army of fighting men and women. The churches have erred by shutting out the laity and making God's work depend on the leaders only. And the army was raised up as a protest against this very mistake. Do not ape the parson. Do not imitate the church. Let your great aim be to raise an army that shall glorify God by fighting his battles."
I'm personally uncomfortable with the term ordination for officers. We're ordained by God in a sense, but I don't think we're ordained by church into a spiritual hierarchy. So to me, I love the idea of being commissioned. Commission still remains akin to the idea of an officer being commissioned to the task, and for the Salvation Army that task is to lead the mission of saving the world. Ordination puts another dimension on that I don't believe is really what the Salvation Army is about.
We believe in commissioning people to specific ministries or functions within the body of Christ and in the mission of the Army. That's our history. To move into an ordination theology exclusively reserved for a priestly caste, if you like, is to undermine the priesthood of all believers. It's to encourage our soldiery, our members, to become more passive and take less ownership of an initiative with our ministry and our mission.
And so that presents us with the obvious question, well then what have we done? How have we translated the word army? What have we done with that? And in my own experience and in my own understanding, our challenge with the army, the military metaphor, is not that we've taken it too seriously, but rather we've not taken it seriously enough and allowed it to run its true course, its full course, to fulfill the potential that that wonderful, powerful metaphor could do.
The breadth of Salvationists' militant understanding of Christ's church on earth became clear to the public in 1884 when they became pivotal in the campaign to end child prostitution. Not only was this not an evangelistic crusade, among its key planners were non-Salvationists, in particular the journalist W.T. Stead, whose tabloid style shaped what became known as the Maiden Tribute campaign. Supporters of the project included the Anglican feminist Josephine Butler and the Roman Catholic Cardinal Manning. The campaign, as conceived by Stead, was perhaps the first newspaper sting. It involved a Salvationist reformed brothel keeper, Rebecca Jarrett, offering money to procure a child. As the transaction took place, Stead lay hidden writing down the details. When published in the Pall Mall Gazette, the story was a sensation. Even the young George Bernard Shaw rushed to help sell copies. The law was soon changed. But then Stead, Rebecca Jarrett and Bramwell Booth were arrested and charged with procuring a child. A further sensation followed. Bramwell was found not guilty as he was not present when the transaction took place, but Stead and Jarrett were both convicted and sent to prison. Stead came to regard his prison garb as a badge of honour, and each year on the anniversary of his imprisonment, he would once again don the uniform and be photographed. That same year, 1884, the Army held its first International Congress, and Frederick St George de la Tour Booth Tucker took the Army into India. A member of the elite Indian civil service, Tucker resigned to join the Salvation Army, and then, married to Booth's daughter Emma, returned to India to introduce the army, not as an agent of empire, but as a wandering teacher. The Tuckers lived and went hungry as Indians, culturally appropriate and personally costly.
You only have to look around the Salvation Army world to see that in very many places now, the leadership in territories is in fact leadership by national officers, people who know their own cultures or who come from similar cultures. One of the challenges we face is to differentiate between local culture and kingdom values. And the challenge is to get people to embrace kingdom values even when they conflict with local culture.
Here too, Stead was an influence on the early army. Stead saw Christianity as a vehicle for progress and uplift among the nations. This pioneering internationalist soon became editor of his own publication, the Review of Reviews, a sort of 19th century version of the internet, a magazine which collected information from publications all around the world and summarised it for subscribers. This insight was also put to work in assisting the Army develop its own network of international communications and publications. In the latter months of 1889 and into 1890, Stead drew particularly close to Catherine and William, working with them on what was to be their call to the world in darkest England and a way out. The Salvation Army was national news. Evangelicals cared about the world. More than that, they were going to fight not just for personal morality, but for just structures in society. Under the dynamic leadership of Commissioner Frank Smith, the Social Reform Wing became the international umbrella body for initiatives such as the Prison Gate Brigades and the Young Joseph Perry. The Army was poised on the brink of global expansion. But just as the 1880s had been a decade of unrivalled success, so the 90s was to prove a decade that threatened the very foundations of the movement. Catherine had breast cancer, and in 1890 it claimed her. In the last few months of her illness, Booth and Stead set up a study beside her bedroom. Here they worked on the manuscript of Darkest England and took it to Catherine for her comments. The family gathered around Catherine for what was to be the last time. Catherine, William and Bramwell had largely created the Salvation Army. The other children had grown into the movement. With Catherine's death, Bramwell assumed more responsibility for the daily running of the movement as William began a long series of overseas tours to sell the Darkest England scheme to the world. Trouble began when a major international change of appointments was announced in late 1895. Ballington and Maud, in charge of the Salvation Army in the United States, objected to being moved on the grounds of their understanding of the distinctives of American culture. William and Bramwell stood firm. In 1902, Kate, known as La Maréchale for her work founding the army in France, resigned. Her husband, Arthur, had become linked to a dispensationalist sect in Chicago. Catherine had reservations, but she could not desert her husband. Later that same year, Herbert clashed with William and Bramwell over the nature of Salvation Army governance, claiming that he needed to have more freedom from Bramwell to take local initiatives in Australasia. Once again, Bramwell and William stood firm. Herbert resigned to become an independent evangelist. Then, in October 1903, Emma, the wife of Frederick Booth Tucker, was killed in a train wreck in the United States. Through the pain of these years, William and Bramwell refused to concede on questions of international governance and control. For William, the very essence of the army, the joint work of he and Catherine, was at stake. The disputes were playing out on a global stage, a repeat of all the reasons they had created the army out of the Christian mission. A theological vision of the kingdom that was about visible as well as spiritual unity, and a command structure that enabled efficient global decision-making across national borders. Such was the strength of his conviction that he was prepared to endure the fracturing of his family. In 1904, another great international congress was held in England. Salvationists gathered from across the globe in what must have seemed to William Booth a confirmation of his stance over the structural unity of the army. This was not a loose confederation of independent churches, but a global mission, a concrete expression of the Church Universal.
I think the willingness of General William Booth to, at great personal cost, maintain the central focus and the international coherence of the Army was extremely important for our effectiveness. I think today the question of the willingness on the part of international leadership to take those kind of risks is not as strong. And there may be some good reasons for that, because power is distributed in very different ways in the Army today. But I think our international coherence is not very strong these days. Whether it can be recaptured, I think, depends upon the right person being our international leader who has the skill and the ability to marshal other leadership, territorial leadership, around this vision of a united international army that together can be an extremely effective and powerful force for God in the world.
Some criticise the Army's globalism as being old-fashioned imperialism. Certainly the Army exploited the trends of the day, but its global vision was more than narrowly imperial. It has its theological foundations in the Arminian tradition, as Hugo Grotius saw God's universal love expressed in relations between nations. And one of W.T. Stead's great achievements was his role in the development of the International Hague Conventions governing the conduct of war. It was the beginning of a movement that led to the Geneva Conventions, the League of Nations, and eventually the United Nations. As Salvationists, we're called to be part of something much larger than a local congregation. With Wesley, Wilberforce and Booth, we're advocates for a redeemed and transformed world.
The Salvation Army sees the world as a whole, and I think that's one of the things that excites young people. We're not interested in just someone's spiritual development or their intellectual development or their social development or their educational development. We are interested in the whole of people. And I think that sense of the holistic gospel, which is intrinsically part of the Salvation Army's worldview, is really exciting to young people, because you're not asking them to compartmentalize their life. You're not asking them to say, do something different from Sunday to Monday. You're not saying that what they wear in youth culture is kind of doesn't have something to do with what they believe. And you're saying to them that actually we have a gospel that literally matches our hour. If ever we needed a holistic gospel that was capable of meeting all kinds of diverse needs in very many extreme circumstances, it's now, maybe even more so than in the late 19th century.
It's perhaps only now, in the first decade of a new century, that the full potential of the Army's ecclesiological commitment to a global movement of the priesthood of all is coming into its own.
A delegation of Salvationists from 10 countries around the world has just returned from New York, where they represented us at the United Nations Status on Women conference. This was a particularly challenging involvement for the women, and one in which they were able both to network with non-Christian agencies and to make the Salvation Army very visible in the United Nations context.
Here on the streets of Midtown Manhattan, not far from the United Nations building, in streets that over a century ago saw the creation of the caring Salvation Army lass, Commissioner Christine McMillan is helping reshape that image for the global streets and lanes of the 21st century.
All social justice issues are moral issues that we all need to take responsibility for. The decisions I make today are for the next generation. whether it's a human resource, a world resource, or a decision that has my own personal choices affecting the failure of someone else.
We have always responded to social need with social services, and in our early days we were very vocal when it came to social justice issues. Now we want to take our stand again, not just together with other organisations, but as the Salvation Army. This is what is expected of Salvation Army soldiers around the world.
In drawing on its heritage, the Salvation Army is recovering a set of powerful ideas for the present. Acting as an army, a body of believers has the capacity to achieve things beyond the reach of individuals or local congregations.
The establishment of the Social Justice Commission is evidence of the fact that both the International Salvation Army and our General in particular is prepared to run risks. We may lose some donors when we take a stand in certain situations, but that's okay. Isn't that what Jesus did? And he is our example.
Salvationist history also offers other examples for the present. Salvationists offended the powerful and went to jail over the Maiden tribute campaign, a struggle now waged on a global scale in the war on sexual trafficking, including the Western trend towards sexualisation of children in advertising. William Booth did not hesitate to give offence when, in frustration at Australia's reluctance to support plans for the migration of poor and dispossessed refugees from the squalor of London and other cities, he declared,
"It seems to me that immediately a man lands on these shores, he sticks up a placard and shouts, 'Australia for the Australians!' A nation cannot be untrue to the great principles which have to do with human happiness and welfare without suffering any more than the individual. And selfishness, if it is hateful in the individual, must be deplorable in the nation."
Sweated labour and unsafe working conditions led the army to open a match factory to save the poor of England. Child labour, exploitation and unsafe working conditions are issues through much of the developing world today. In the 1890s, the Salvation Army pioneered fair trade when it established the Hamadava Tea Company to market Ceylonese tea through army outlets around the world. In the 1990s, mirroring the army of the 1890s, the Salvation Army in Australia established Employment Plus, an agency that quickly became one of the largest providers of employment services in the country. This vast network of services that included prison reform, alcohol and drug rehabilitation, employment services, a Salvation Army bank, legal services, migration agents and even a matrimonial agency were integrated through the structures of the Darkest England scheme. The international framework of the Darkest England scheme no longer exists, and many of its services have been broken up into isolated agencies. Who would recognise in the Family Tracing Service, for instance, a faint shadow of the Salvation Army Intelligence Department, a research and data collection agency that Booth hoped would grow into a university of humanity? But the essence of Booth's vision remains. The Salvation Army was structurally attuned to the first great wave of globalisation that marked the late 19th century. And so it may be today.
Churches in the 19th and 20th century engaging with social issues discovered that they had to provide national organizations in order to engage nations about these social issues. What's happened now is that you get both a global structure and a local kind of focus. And so the national structures are crumbling because nation states aren't particularly where the action is anymore. But they're both very local kinds of organizations which are grassroots and dealing with particular issues, and global kinds of associations of NGOs and other organizations that deal with things from environmental issues to social justice to child trafficking, other kinds of issues which require much more global reach. And how it is that religious groups are going to reorganize themselves to deal with these issues is one of the challenges of the 21st century.
These same issues have a vital local dimension. Just as we have seen the unintended consequences of imported beliefs on our theology, so it applies to our local ecclesiology, our distinctive way of being Christ. One of the most marked is our understanding of the church as connectional rather than congregational in nature. It's what enabled us to be an army. Yet many of the church growth programs embraced over recent years are based on an essentially congregational view of the church. And if adopted uncritically, they may risk limiting our horizons and even impairing our unity as a visibly connected global body, an army. And in a world saturated with self-interest, that army still remains one of the most respected of religious bodies.
They have no idea the power of that brand. And I say to officers, you take that brand off your corps, well, first of all, you're going to have to go out and find a whole infrastructure of support and dollars to make anything work. I mean, it's ridiculous the way people cannot celebrate who we are, because it's global as well. It's world. And isn't it interesting that people outside the framework have no difficulty in celebrating who we are?
People respect the army in part because they can see it and believe it stands for something. What then of our personal distinctives, those expected of every soldier, such as abstinence and uniform?
In the 21st century, there's much more religious diversity than we had previously. That's true in almost every society around the world. As that diversity increases, people use symbols, clothing, food choices, etc., to declare their religious allegiance. And as they do that, other people who might have not done that begin to say, well, what should we do to make clear what our religious association is? And in that context, there's an increase in the wearing of yarmulkes, there's an increase in the wearing of headdress amongst Muslims. I wear a pin saying I'm an Anglican. People are adopting these things. And so that the presence of religious insignia in the public space is much more present than it was before.
The issue of uniform actually comes up on a regular basis amongst young people. They actually wonder about the relevance of it. I actually want to say that I think the Salvation Army uniform is incredibly important. It actually helps us in our work on the streets. It gives us credibility and it gives us recognition. The reality is, though, that we actually need to be flexible in the way we wear the uniform. We need to come up with different types of uniforms to fit the different situations that we find ourselves in. Sometimes we confuse uniform wearing with soldiership, but soldiership is the critical thing. It's the vows of soldiership that actually mark our distinctive. It doesn't matter what we're wearing, as long as we remember that we are committed to a sacrificial way of living, that we always remember that we are a soldier, part of an army, always committed to transforming this world for God.
The uniform is most clearly appreciated at times of crisis, from the ruins of the World Trade Center to the Asian tsunami. We are constantly reminded of our interdependence. We must learn how to live more carefully. In that section of darkest England where Booth writes of the need to reconnect society, the example he uses is care for the environment, the need to recycle and reclaim the waste products of our society. His sense of the global village resonates with our need to care for the planet. Think globally, act locally. It could be a working definition of the Salvation Army.
Another one of the interesting initiatives, and one which I was involved in when I was in the Philippines, one which I think could be replicated in other contexts, is that of Echo Kids. Echo Kids is a whole program for young people, teenagers and younger children to engage environmental issues and the consciousness of their responsibility to care for God's creation. Poor people cannot afford the luxury often of the environmental consciousness that people in developed countries have. But when you start with their children and educate the kids then go home to their family, they start to look after family pets, they start to recycle goods that the family has not thought of recycling. And so you get a whole new consciousness within the family, which has been generated by the children of that family.
Here too is the basis for a renewed evangelism, an evangelism centred on a broken world and broken lives, the healing love of Christ and our response as agents of grace. Some suggest the Salvation Army is now more of a settled church rather than a dynamic mission, that we should forget what the Salvation Army was and adjust ourselves to what it is. Yet as we have seen, the issues that called the Army into being have not diminished. They reach across the globe and into every corner of every community. And is it really an either-or question? Should we not so inform our congregations that they function not as settled groups designed to sustain themselves, but as platforms from which to launch the weapons provided by our heritage into a new century? We began this series with the work of pioneer Salvationists like James and Alice Barker, Thomas Coombs and Herbert Booth, much of it from this building at 69 Burke Street, Melbourne, the City Temple Core. In 1998, after more than 100 years of service and witness in the heart of the city, the old core was formally closed. Today, the building is a vision of new life, and we are here for something very special.
And this final award is a very special one. It's called the Living Legend Award. And who do you think it's for?
I love this place, this platform on which we're standing. Our general, our founder, preached on this platform 4 times. And when I sit on Sundays and listen to the worship, I sometimes imagine him standing here and saying, this is the kind of place I like.
Well, this room is at the top of the building where we have the mission of 614 Melbourne. And it's a very famous room because here Herbert Booth and Joseph Perry had their Limelight film studio. And at 614, we're very keen at linking the past to the present and the future, so that I would like all Salvationists to realise how significant our past is as we learn from the lessons and apply them to the present.
In 2003, the Army appointed Sandra and I as the officers here, and I still remember the very first Sunday that we arrived. There were 11 people in an auditorium that holds 550, and 5 of those 11 were from our family, Sandra and I and our 3 girls, and the other 6 were just a demoralised bunch of people. And they were sitting in the balcony, some were doing their knitting, others were doing their nails. As I looked around that temple, I realised that the future of that corps didn't lie within that building, but it actually existed out on the streets. And I started to understand that our mission was on our doorstep, because when I walked out the front gates, there were homeless people sleeping out there. When I walked out the side door of the building, there were kids down the lane shooting up. And I recognised very clearly that this was our mission field. These were the people that we really needed to engage with. The other thing I needed to understand was that I really needed resource to help us in the mission to the poor. And so I started to build relationships with the top end of town, with corporates, with the Lord Mayor, with the Premier, state government, because that's where the resources lay.
I think whether you are a state government, a subnational government that is, or a national government, or a city government as we are, we now look for partners in our wider community. And so some of the most powerful work we do is directly with the Salvation Army, funding them to run programs that are of great importance to the city. That might be, for instance, funding street teams. It is a remarkable success. We can intervene with young people, often before there is a police intervention necessary, and we can help young people to get home safely late at night when, as I say, they may be a danger to themselves or others.
Once we got going here, one of the things we realised was that there was this increasing number of young people around the Army who were looking for mission opportunities. They go to conferences, they get all inspired about doing the Army's mission, and then they struggle to actually find opportunity to do that. And so we started something called Order 614, which is a 12-month full-time live-in gap year program where young people actually get the opportunity to do hands-on mission. And the young people love it, and it actually has an impact upon them to the point where it challenges their values, and it actually helps them become soldiers back in their own corps, who have got a real heart for the original mission of the Salvation Army, which is fantastic.
Well, 614, of course, comes from the great prophet Isaiah. In chapter 61, verse 4, it says there that God is going to restore, renew, and rebuild the damaged, devastated cities. Well, here, we're doing those three things for people. A lot of young people wandering around this city without any purpose and motive in life, so we can be there to help them. So somehow 614 really suits our purpose here.
All sorts of people, including corporates, actually want to get involved in the Army's mission. So AMP have actually come to us and said that they wanted to fund a double-decker youth bus that goes out most nights of the week, engaging with 70 to 100 under 25s each night of the week. And their staff get involved in that process as well. And as they get involved, they actually get touched by the mission too. We now have 24 staff working here, and we also have over 1,000 active volunteers on our database. And those volunteers do all sorts of things here. They're out on the streets at night, they're out on the outreach van, they're on the youth bus, they're working in the Hamadava Cafe, they're working in our hospitality program as well. We're working with over 2,000 people a week.
69 Burke Street, right in the city of Melbourne, has an honoured place in our religious and our social history. But really, it's what goes on inside that building that is the way forward. That's the future. That is the Salvation Army reaching out to the broader community to help those who are less fortunate, to offer hope and optimism throughout our community, and to be an active player in the Melbourne that we want to be. The Salvos make Melbourne a much kinder, a much more generous city.
The thing I love about what we do here is that I think for the first time I sort of feel that my faith and my life are in total harmony. One moment you're helping someone who's completely distressed and offering them practical assistance, just to walk into another conversation and people say, where was God when I was a child and 3 years old and being abused? Where was God? Tell me, you know, we've got a loving God. And just meeting people in that pain and being able to share with them that, hey, there is a God who loves you, there is a God who cares. And it's not just lip service. Lip service is not enough. They have to see by your works and by hanging in there with them, you know, when they're testing the boundaries, you know, and say, I'm not going to give up on you and I'm not going to let go. And that's exactly the way God treats you. It's just that total harmony.
I came here because I believe that at 614 Melbourne, we're doing what the Salvation Army was brought into being to do. You know, William Booth said the homeless, the unemployed, the poor were the people he cared for. So we care for those people. And I believe the Army is an urban mission, because that's where we started in the beginning, in London and in the great cities. And so we're here in the city of Melbourne, being what the Army should really be.
William Booth gave his last lecture to social officers the year before he died. He did not retreat from the twofold vision. He looked back to the days when James Barker had stood outside the old Melbourne jail and reinforced the necessity of a religion that cares for this world. W.T. Stead also maintained his commitment to the church and the world throughout his later years. In 1912, he was invited to address a religious gathering in the United States concerned with getting men back into church. He chose the latest and greatest means of transport available, the biggest ship afloat. In April 1912, W.T. Stead sailed on the Titanic. Here he was portrayed in the 1960 film A Night to Remember. It's said that as the great ship went down, he retired to the first-class library to read a book. A few months later, William Booth also lay down his sword. Following Stead's death, journalists of 2 continents erected a unique memorial to the memory of the man who had changed their craft. This memorial stands in Central Park in New York. An identical memorial stands on the Thames Embankment in London, close to Westminster and the Houses of Parliament. But for Stead, it was this picture from prison that mattered. We began this program with Stead's challenge to the Salvation Army. It's perhaps appropriate we conclude with his challenge to each of us. When serving time in jail following the Maiden tribute campaign, Stead wrote a series of letters from his prison cell. After his death, they were published by his daughter. In one of them, he writes,
"Do you know what I think Jesus Christ would do if he came now? He would go to church and chapel ever so many times and listen, and no one would speak to him. He would look to see who sat round him, and he would see no ragged people, no thieves, no harlots, only respectable people. And he would hear all these respectable people singing hymns to Christ and giving all the glory to Christ. And then after standing it a long time, Jesus would stand up someday in the middle of the church and say just 2 words, 'Damn Christ.' And then he would go out and go down some slum and put his arms round the neck of some poor lost orphan girl who was having a bitter cry and say, 'Come unto me, all ye that are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest.' The hardest cross Christ has to bear is the cross that is made of those who call themselves his own church." Shortly after, he writes, "Never tell anyone to be a Christian. Always tell them to be Christ."
Together, we have looked at the spirit of the army, its theology and its practice. William and Catherine Booth shared a Wesleyan understanding of Christ and his mission. In the midst of a global social and technological revolution, they developed a joyous and radically practical approach to mission, based on God's love for the world, the connectedness of the church, and the priesthood of all believers. It was a movement designed for such a time as this.
Now I share the gospel with words, but I also share the gospel in the manner in which I live out my faith in the world. The fact is that when it comes to that final judgment, I am going to be judged not according to whether I was a good preacher, not according to whether I was looking smart in my army uniform. I will be judged according to the way in which I ministered to others in the name of Jesus.
I often have to go to the theater to pick up music that challenges me. I went to see the musical Les Miserables. I don't know whether you saw that. Boy, that had a closing song that ought to be in the Salvation Army movement. Here's the closing song. You could use this at a Salvation Army gathering at any occasion. When the revolutionaries come back from the grave and sing to the audience, "Who will be brave and stand with me? Who will join in our crusade? For beyond the barricades is the world you wished would be." Can't you hear them sing the song? Can't you hear them beat the drum? It's the future that they bring when tomorrow comes.
We'll join in our crusade. We will be strong and stand with thee. Somewhere beyond the barricade, is there a world you long to see? Do you hear the people sing? Say, do you hear the distant drums? This is the future that we bring when tomorrow comes. Will you join in our crusade? Who will be strong and stand with me? Somewhere beyond the barricade, is there a world you long to see? Do you hear the people sing? Say, do you hear the distant drum?